in the background. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Humboldt-University's KOSMOS-Lectures, which this semester have a water theme. My name is Tobias Krüger. I'm professor of Hydrology and Society at the Geography Department and the Integrative Research Institute THESys, which stands for Transformations of Human Environment Systems. I'm asked to tell you after the talk, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and then you will be put in the order that you raise your hand. You will be put into the room where you see Naho, Mirumachi, and myself. So you kind of join the panel or join the podium, and then you can ask your question in person and everyone can see you. And if you don't want to do this, you are welcome to write your question in the chat, and I might see it, and then I will ask the question for you. And if not, then there are people working in the background that tell me through other channels that there are questions that I need to raise, and then I will do that. Okay, so here you have two modes of asking questions. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce our guest today, who is Naho Mirumachi from King's College London. She's our first speaker of the KOSMOS-Lecture series this semester. And Naho is a reader in environmental politics at the Geography Department of King's College. She's an expert in the politics and governance of transboundary river basins, meaning these are basins shared by more than one country. And Naho and I, we have known each other for some time, even we haven't met that many times, but we've met about 10 years ago. And when I first met Naho, she had just introduced a more nuanced perspective on conflict to the studies of transboundary water politics. This was really well received at the time. And she even went beyond conflict by also considering forms of cooperation and the oscillations between conflict and cooperation, of course, which was really quite new at the time. And the approach has, you can say, invigorated the field of transboundary water politics, and has also been used by other fields, by scholars in other fields, like, for example, infrastructures of divided cities. Naho is also the convener of King's Water, which I would say is an internationally renowned hub for the latest thinking on the political economy of water. And she is also a contributor to the IPCC's sixth assessment report. And we invited Naho particularly because she has written a book in 2020. She has co-authored this with two other authors, and the book is called Water Conflicts: Analysis for Transformation. And this book is also quite remarkable in that it goes beyond critiquing the prevailing techno-managerial interventions, and it goes towards truly transformative analysis. So the analysis itself, sees itself as being transformative, and that's quite new in the field too. Some of the mainstream is just content with critique, and she goes beyond this in the book. And I think we will get a taste of the spirit of the book and Naho's unique approach from her talk, which she calls a water agenda for our time. Much needed, and not much from me at that point here. I will hand over to Naho and will say we look forward to your talk very much, Naho. It's great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna try and see if I can. Is my screen showing the PowerPoint? Not yet.
You should share it, right?
Okay.
Your screen is not yet sharing this. So.
It's not sharing. Okay, let me try and do that again to see if we can see the screen. Okay, so I think that should work now.
Yeah, we can see it, but yeah, do the full screen.
There we go.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Naho.
Okay. All right, so we're on track. Thank you so much for this invitation. I have to say it's a real privilege and honor to be part of this series. And I really want to thank Toby, the organizers, Julia, who've been in touch with me constantly, helping me through every step of the process, despite the uncertainties with the COVID situation. I'm very glad, nevertheless, to be here online. I say it's a real privilege and honor because as a geographer, I'm very aware of Humboldt and his KOSMOS-Lecture series. It was a very ambitious, set of writings that he set out, but also at the same time, it was very accessible to specialists as well as people who are not necessarily academics or researchers. So with that spirit, I will try and bring out some ideas that I have been thinking about regarding water and how we can rethink our relationship with water in a very uncertain, very changing world. I will present, therefore, some broad ideas. I'm not going to nitpick on specific theories or drill down on specific case studies. But by doing so, by giving you some broad ideas, I hope that you will be able to have some nuggets of ideas in your head that you can take home at the end of this evening. So I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and I'm very much curious about the questions that you might have. So please do ask various kinds of questions that may touch upon some of the slides. There's plenty of things that I may not be able to cover in the slides, so I'd be happy to explore, expand during the Q&A as well. So I've called this lecture talk rather ambitiously, rather boldly, a water agenda fit for our times. And the reason why I ask this, the reason why I call for this is because I think we really need to start asking some fundamental questions about how we think about the ways in which water flows through our societies, not just in terms of physical flows, but through the ideas, through the political systems, economic systems, and touch upon our everyday. So the driving question is sort of encapsulated by some of these risk assessment reports that you might see. So this is one from AXA, a major insurer. And I think this is just from earlier this year, 2011. And they say that, experts see the top 10 risks of the world as including, number 6, natural resources and biodiversity risks. If you look at other risk reports, such as the World Economic Forum, they say that, the top 5 risks in the world somehow relate to water, whether it's about disasters, extreme weather events, environmental degradation, etc. So while we have climate change, number 1, and we have things like cybersecurity attacks, pandemic, as we've been experiencing too much the last 2.5 years, we can clearly see how water and natural resources are very much integral to our current psyche, the modern day thinking about how we perceive the current and how we perceive the future and future risks as well. Water is very much part of a political agenda, a global political agenda as well. If you recall the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG 6 is exactly about water. And despite these commitments towards ensuring that people have safe, clean water, that people are living in better water environments, we still have 2 billion people, or a little under a third of the global population, that didn't have safely managed drinking water. So alongside the various disasters, we do have some very immediate problems of everyday drinking water as well. So the question that I'm going to ask is to say, what is really needed for the major challenge of water governance in this very risk-oriented, uncertain world? And I'll give you the flavor, the sort of the idea, the direction of travel that I'm going to make over the next 40 minutes is to say that we really need to have a transformative approach, that we need to rethink the way in which water and society are intertwined. And one of my motivations to saying this is that we tend to not look after some of the marginalized, most vulnerable people in society. I think COVID, the pandemic, really exposed this really well. But it's not just about the pandemic. Actually, even when it comes to things like drinking water, we've not really taken care of some of the most vulnerable, some of the most marginalized people within our societies. And if we really are serious about tackling the major challenge, we really need to rethink why we've been so good at leaving these people behind and what kind of new actions we need to take up in order to do this. So it's not just a simple change, it's not just a simple tweak, it's not just a simple technological innovation that we need. I think it's a deep rethink of water and society. The way I'm going to go forward in the next couple of minutes is to first of all take stock of these uncertainties and extremes. Water is very much cross-cutting across many sectors. And so I want to sort of give you a flavor, give you a broader understanding of how through water we can see some of the challenges, we can see some of the potential synergies as well, not just the challenges, but the synergies that we can look at. And then I'm going to propose two solutions that are based upon the research that I've done in the last couple of years. One is to focus on water diplomacy, and I'll end with another solution thinking about human rights and how we can better leverage human rights. So we'll make a start. So how do we make sense of water uncertainties? We now say that we are in a situation of flux, that there is no static situation of the hydrological cycle. We're in a situation of non-stationarity, that there are these unexpected ways in which the hydrological cycle is affected, as well as society. Society has faced with so many unexpected geopolitical, societal disruptions over the past couple of years. So in amongst all of this, what does it really mean when we talk about the challenges of water governance? As I've said, we are already in a very water-stressed world. There are extremes of flooding, but as well as droughts and water scarcity. And the problem with water is that we can't access water when we need it, where we need it. It's not distributed evenly throughout the world. And as this diagram shows, we have a situation of population growth by 2050. We're going to be in a situation where many regions are going to have increasing population growth as well as increasing water stress. The reason why population is an issue is because it's not just about the number of bodies that we need to have enough drinking water for, or have enough toilets, sanitation, taps, and as well as food. It's because as populations grow, societies change, we're going to be seeing a range in which rich societies become richer, become more affluent. Formerly less developed countries are increasingly moving up the ladder of prosperity, as it were. And so we're going to be seeing major changes in consumption of people. And as societies become more affluent, quite often it means that it becomes more materialistic. So it means more food that we're going to drink, that we're going to eat. It's also going to mean that there's going to be more material goods that we consume. And these all require water inputs. One of the things that I'll highlight early on is that about 80%, 70 to 90%, depending on where you are, but let's say 80% of all water goes into the agricultural sector. So the food that we make, the items that we produce from cotton, for example, whether it's for clothing, whether it's for textiles, etc., these all require water inputs. And as societies become more affluent and there's a higher material demand, we're going to be requiring more food, more goods, therefore more water resources. So being in a water scarce, stressed situation is not going to be a very good position to be in the future. One of the reasons why climate change has really sort of brought to the fore a lot of people's thinking about natural resources and natural resources risks as something interrelated is because, as you can see in this figure, around 44% of disasters that we've experienced between the last 30 decades is really around floods and water. And so what people are experiencing increasingly are more of these extremes, exposure to harm through natural disasters, water-related disasters. And there are many studies that talk about how these disasters lead on to further knock-on effects of poverty, of migration as well. As I said, agriculture is the biggest water user. Here you can see what the withdrawal levels were like across different continents in 2019. This isn't likely going to change drastically. We're still going to be seeing in the future a large proportion of water going into the agricultural sector. So thinking about the way we farm, thinking about the way we eat, thinking about the way in which we reduce food waste, for example, become very important aspects. But there are also other things that we need to think about is where do we grow food, how do we use land, and what do we use it for? Because it's in competition with other types of goods that we can grow. So it's not just growing crops for food, but it can also be crops for biofuels, for example. Despite the fact that there's been a heavy impact on water use in the agricultural sector and agricultural productivity increasing over the last couple of years, what we're seeing is still great disparity across region around food insecurity. And as a result of food insecurity, what happens is that there are also situations of malnutrition as well. And existing studies show that quite often women are at the receiving end of experiencing more severe exposure to food insecurity or malnutrition, as well as with children as well. So there's disparity across regions, but the way people experience it at the everyday level is also going to be very different. Climate change, as I say, throws into some really, throws a spanner in the way we think about. So the rule of thumb, general rule of thumb is the drier you are, if you're in a dry region, you're going to become drier. If you're in a wet region, you're going to become wetter. So the extremes are going to be even more highlighted. But if you drill down into specific in-country regions, if you look at specific parts of river basins, if you look at specific parts of areas where it's possible to do agriculture, you see a much more mixed picture. So here we're looking at Eastern Africa, and there are some areas where we are going to be seeing drops in productivity, but then there are some areas where we might see some increases in productivity as well. So it's not just a picture of who's going to be able to produce where and more, or who's not going to be able to produce food and therefore have to think about alternative livelihoods. It's really also about thinking the spectrum in which these changes might affect livelihoods. It's not a simple more production or less production, even in a country. And so policies are going to have to be very sensitive to these changes. And going back to this point about what are we growing, what is the purpose of agriculture? Increasingly, we've been talking about adaptation solutions that, for example, focus on clean energy. And whilst those may go towards meeting our climate change goals, we know that they are very often water intensive. So you see a figure of how much water it is required to produce a liter of bioethanol. It's 2,100 liters, so it's not insignificant. So green doesn't mean it's always not water intensive. And it does require a significant amount of irrigation as well. So in the figure, you see lots of green dots. Those are amounts of water through rainwater, but the blue dots is the amount of water required through irrigation. So if you want to produce bioethanol, there's a chance that we have to pump out more water from our rivers, from our aquifers, etc. Things like dams, hydropower dams, again, clean forms of energy, but highly controversial. They've caused a lot of social protests in the past. And going further, even though climate change policies may call for renewable energy, we really need to think about how our river basins are going to be reshaped and what kind of implications they're going to be. So as I hinted already at the start, the hydrological system is not so natural. This is the kind of textbook picture that you might see where you have rain that falls and then it evaporates. There's water running from the rivers, there's glaciers that are melting, etc. But there's not a single human in this figure, but there's so much of human implications in this figure. And so we really do have an anthropocentric impact on this hydrological cycle. And as it's been argued around climate security, on issues of climate security and environmental security, the kind of hydrological system that we create, the kind of earth system that we create, the kind of climate system that we create is not just a natural question anymore. It's very much a political question, because it's affected by the way in which we abstract from the natural resources, the way in which we impact the various pressures on rivers, aquifers. These are not just simply technical, neutral questions. These are questions of choice by society that governments make, that communities make. And so as a result, we're getting a lot of policy debate on, well, if it's a political question, if it's not just purely a technical issue, there's going to be disagreements about what kind of climate change policies, how we use natural resources, how we govern our environment. These are all going to bubble up. And the policy debate has really focused very much wrapped around the debate of climate change on fragility and conflict. So I have a series of reports here on this screen where you can see various policy briefs or reports that have really started to think about where are the conflict hotspots going to be, how is fragility, how is the instability of governments and regions going to impact the way in which we use our natural resources, the way in which we think about climate change, how we adapt, how we mitigate to climate change, etc. The United Nations a couple of years ago developed their climate security mechanism, which really tries to hone in thinking about, well, how can we best leverage finance, for example, so that we think about not just the way in which adaptation is done or mitigation is done, but also thinking about the implications to and from conflict. A lot of the climate affected areas are these conflict affected areas as well. So how do we think about these two? And there's debates about the climate conflict nexus as well. And as I say, again, it's a very compounded issue. It's about how water is connected with land, is connected with agriculture, is connected with food. And it's in a context of instability, of uncertainty, political uncertainty, and even protracted crisis. So the figure you see on the screen shows you that quite often countries with protracted crises, that countries that have existing underlying conflict really do feel the effects of food security. And so thinking about how water is used, how land is used, and how that contributes to food security amidst all of this is very important. So this seemed like it was a bit of a doomsday scenario in the sense that there are so many interlinking factors. There's a lot of political concern. There's a lot of policy debates. So what can we do about it? It's important that we somehow understand the interlinkages between water, energy, food. We need to understand the underlying climate change impacts, the drivers of climate change. We also need to understand that these are political questions of our times. We also need to deal with existing conflict or protracted conflict. That's a really full list of things to do. But I think there are places where we can start off with, and this is my first solution towards a water agenda that's fit for our times. And I'm talking about water diplomacy that can be much better at looking at alternatives, looking for ways in which livelihoods and the ways in which people experience environmental harm or degradation can be reduced. Let me expand on this. One of the most recent IPCC reports obviously picked up on the relationship between water, climate, and conflict. And what they concluded, what they wrote in their report is that in summary, there is no consensus on the causal association between observed climate change and conflicts. Still, evidence exists that those tensions can be amplified depending on climatic variables and other concomitant socioeconomic and political factors. So what this means is that there's been a range of studies that have been done that focused on precipitation, for example, that focused on temperature rise, for example, that looked at different kinds of a situation of agriculture or different ways in which land is being used, and therefore water is also being used. But there seems to be no universal consensus on what are the major drivers or how do these causal implications play out, because it's very contextual. I can't emphasize enough that this is very, very contextual. What happens in, for example, Eastern Africa is not going to be same in Southeast Asia. It's not going to be even the same probably in Southern Africa as well, even though they might be on the same continent. It's interesting how the IPCC report talks about looking at climatic variables and other concomitant socioeconomic and political factors. And I think this is where the debate of conflicts, the debate about instability, fragility come into play. And so in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of renewed focus, I should say. There's always been a focus, but there's been heightened interest in looking at water diplomacy to deal with these aspects of conflict, water-related conflicts, and trying to see how we can better understand the very contextual, very complex causation between climate, water, and conflict. Water diplomacy has been argued as something that really needs to step up to the plate and deliver for governments to take it up. And as a definition, for example, I'm showing you on the screen something taken from GWP, the Global Water Partnership, and they have a toolbox, they have a toolkit. And they define water diplomacy as something that ensures regional cooperation using water resources management as an entry point and create solution spaces for broader cooperation, that there are different technical and diplomatic mechanisms that can be used to unpack complex water issues. And it's really seen as a way to think about improving peace and regional stability. So water diplomacy in this definition is to use water resources as an entry point, as a mechanism through which broader aspects of cooperation, of peace and stability can be sought. And so there's been policy discussions, for example, about the rise of water diplomacy. This was a title of a very interesting policy paper a couple of years ago, that water diplomacy really can't just be within the realm of river managers. It needs to be elevated up to foreign ministers, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so that they can take on this big issue of peace and regional stability. There are other definitions. For example, you're seeing on the screen one by IUCN. And what they say is that, yes, water diplomacy is something that operates under the authority of sovereign states. So they are putting states in the center stage. And they say it's something that unlocks cooperation between multiple stakeholders, but we've got to look at municipalities, provinces, civil society. It's a multi-level governance process. And so while the sovereign state might be in the center, we have a range of stakeholders, a range of vested actors who input into the decision making. It's interesting how these two definitions, even though they're very different, one comes from, a GWP, the Global Water Partnership, where a lot of governments have put in money so that they can do capacity building. Another is an international civil society organization that are working at various community level, basin level contexts. Both of them do talk about the state. Both of them do talk about the need for cooperation. And a lot of the times this is related to the fact that where there are debates around water, the quantity or the quality, how you want to develop the river basin or the aquifer, it's often because of the transboundary implications. So you can see here a map of the number of transboundary river basins as well as aquifers that we have. It's pretty much everywhere. The only continent that doesn't have it where humans actually live is Australia, because Australia, the Australian continent is one country, but they have, of course, a federal system. And so there are rivers that span across states, even in that continent. But you can see the blue areas represent transboundary rivers and lakes. There's plenty of them, particularly in Europe. I think we're at the forefront of looking at rivers from a pollution perspective, as well as quantity. The EU Water Framework Directive has been instrumental in that. But there's also many, many areas of transboundary aquifers. This year is the year of transboundary aquifers or groundwater bodies. The 2020 UN Water World Water Day was exactly about that. And quite often it receives less attention. I think the rivers and lakes quite often receive a lot of attention because it's a lot easier to see. You can go visit a river, you can dispute a river basin when there's a dam that chops up, fragments the river. But there's plenty of communities as well as economic production that really relies on groundwater systems. So you can see that there's 286 transboundary river basins, even more transboundary aquifers, 592 even, and 153 countries are involved in this. So water diplomacy is very much about everybody's business, considering this number, considering how we're reliant on these transboundary river basins and groundwater aquifers. I say there has been a heightened, renewed interest in water diplomacy, largely in reaction to some of the major past failures of water diplomacy. It's always been there. Negotiations over river basins have always been there. River basin projects have always cropped up in transboundary river basins that are shared by 2 states or more. But in particular, we've seen major river basins where they have really come up across problems of water allocation and coming up with a cooperative river basin development plan. And the Nile is particularly representative. And I'm showing you this blog or short commentary that was written by the Vice President of the European Commission about 2 years ago, where he said that the Nile is really worrying, the situation along the Nile, where the upstream and downstream states have not been able to come to an agreement over the development of a major dam. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is very concerning. The negotiations have been going on for very many years. And this is becoming not just an issue of water and how big or how much electricity the hydropower dam is going to generate. It's actually about the geopolitics of that region. And the European Commission has a vested interest in looking at this because they want to support the African Union so that water diplomacy can be better practiced, that there can be some sort of mediation, that there can be ways in which the countries along the Nile can come to some sort of agreement and not be in deadlock. There's other examples of past failures. I would argue it's been very well documented what's happened in the Jordan River Basin, for example. There's also a lot of critique about dam building in South America, for example, where quite often farmers, indigenous communities have really been at the mercy of these big international agreements that are being put into place. And I think one of the reasons why we've managed to fail in some of the ways in which we do water diplomacy is because it's been much too narrowly focused on how much water is going to go to state A and how much water is going to go to state B. It's been much too narrowly focused on specific ideas about a water allocation within the confines of a treaty, of an international treaty, what gets put in an international agreement, what's not in an agreement. These are all very important. I'm not going to deny that, you know, international water law is not important. In fact, it's very important. But I think that the sort of broader consideration in which international water law, in which agreements, in which treaties, in which diplomacy is used hasn't really been cognizant, hasn't really taken into full consideration of the political economy of water, about the geopolitics of the region, about the drivers and changes in non-water sectors, which inevitably affect how we use water, how we develop the river basin or the groundwater aquifer. And when I say the political economy of water, I'm talking about things like the ways in which the water, food, energy nexus is increasingly linked. About 30% of energy use in the world actually goes into food production. So it's not just about how water intensive energy production can be, it can be about how energy intensive food production can be. So thinking about water, energy, food nexus is very important. We've seen fluctuations of global food prices. In general, the trend has been downwards. And there's very good papers, very good analysis to demonstrate that. But the spikes in food prices really affect individuals and communities. And even if it's a downward trend over 30 years, if you are a farmer, if you are the head of household needing to feed your family, then these price hikes are going to affect you very much, both in terms of how much food you can eat, but also in terms of your livelihood. You may have to seek different forms of livelihoods. You may have to seek another job, a second, third job, for example. There are other really major drivers that are in place, like poverty. We almost forget about poverty because it's so prevalent, but actually it's very much still defining features of the context in which the political economy of water plays out, the places where agriculture is done, the labor for which that agriculture is provided is wrapped up in various situations of poverty and various degrees of poverty. And as countries put out, 5-year development plans or SDG plans, these are all based on specific visions of development, specific ideals around how GDP can be increased, what kind of development trajectory or path it's going to go on. It's also about the geopolitics of natural resource disputes. So I'm not just talking about how water is disputed along the river, across the tributaries. It can also be about borders. It can also be about territories. Rivers can form borders with other countries, but it can also be wrapped up around land. So disputes over borders, disputes over territory is inevitably about land. Land often holds water because a river flows through it or there's water underneath it. And so thinking about these really seemingly unrelated but deeply interconnected debates around the geopolitics and how sovereign states practice their authority in this is also very important to consider. And so once I've told you about so many of these big factors at play, there's so many of these big contextual factors that we need to think about, water diplomacy, I would argue, is simply not about fixing a water conflict. Water diplomacy so far, as I say, has narrowly been too focused on resolving water conflict or addressing a dispute over water allocation. But actually, if we are really serious about water diplomacy as a way to drive forward a new agenda, I think we need to think about alternatives. How can water diplomacy come about with new alternatives that consider cross-sector synergies, trade-offs, really think about that farmer who's going to be impacted by the food price hike, really thinking about the communities that are going to be facing exposure to flooding, exposure to extreme weather events. And so the scope of water diplomacy really stretches out. It's not just about water, it's not just about the river, it's not just about groundwater. It's going to be about how we think about agriculture, it's how we think about food security, it's going to be how we generate electricity, how we produce energy, how we think about climate adaptation options that are going to be requiring water inputs. And through all of this, it's impossible to talk about water diplomacy without thinking about both conflict and cooperation. Water diplomacy is going to be very much negotiating the ways in which coexisting conflict and cooperation play out. Water diplomacy cannot be the eradication of conflict and improving cooperation, even though the definitions that I've introduced earlier do really focus on cooperation. It really needs to think about how, it's really about the process in which we seek views, we seek alternatives to the existing treaties that are in place, to the existing policies that are in place that are much too narrow, much too technical, into something that's much more broader. That's going to cause conflict, differing views, contentions, but I would argue this is a necessary part of a new water agenda. This doesn't mean, I'm going to stress, that we are going to be seeing more or that there are going to be armed conflict, not at all. The point about conflict and conflict being inevitable is that we need to bring about these contestations out into the open. We need to understand why certain countries want to have hydropower. We need to understand, we need to bring out to the fore how different forms of land use might affect the livelihoods of communities. And that's really a contentious topic, but we can't brush it under the carpet, and we need to talk about both of these. And in the research that I've done, and I have a little picture of the book, and you're welcome to take a read of it. I'd be happy to hear your views if you ever get around to it. But in this book, we looked at different cases from around the world about water diplomacy, and we found that there are quite often supposed cooperation that are happening under the guise of water diplomacy or discussions between countries, but they tend to be destructive in the sense that they tend to favor countries that are more powerful. They tend to favor countries that have more leverage in terms of financial knowledge, political power, geopolitical weight throwing. And so you have token cooperation or shallow cooperation or coercive cooperation, which puts weaker parties, weaker countries in a situation where they can't deliver on their development goals, they can't deliver on protecting the environment, and they certainly put livelihoods of their own citizens at risk. So I won't go into detail of what does token cooperation mean or what does shallow cooperation mean, but quite often all of these don't take into consideration the burdens to the most marginalized. It makes sense from a central policy decision-making perspective, but what does it mean for the actual communities living along the river? That's not taken into consideration. What about the sustainability of the so-called cooperation? That's not taken into account. What about the environmental impacts of the cooperation, supposedly? That's not taken into account. So I'm going to move into the last segment, and I think I have about 5 minutes for the talk. So I'll try and encapsulate another way we can think about solutions. And this is, again, touching upon how do we really protect the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. As a society, we seem to be very good at leaving people behind. And we seem to easily forget that some of our policies actually are quite harmful to people. Some of the treaties that we have in place might not necessarily be benefiting the most vulnerable and most marginalized. And so the work that I've done in the last year or so really has tried to think about how can we make states more accountable. And one of the tools might be to think about human rights. And I go into this topic by first giving you a very interesting figure. And I encourage you to take a look at this webpage. The link to that webpage is on the corner of the PowerPoint, so feel free to Google it. But this is the Land Matrix webpage, and it shows you what kind of large-scale land acquisitions have occurred in different parts of the world. And here you're seeing the African continent, and how many deals there have been over how much land. And here you can see the number of deals and the deal size on the right-hand side of your screen. But in general, globally, in 2009, 56 million hectares were under large-scale land acquisitions. That's not an insignificant number. But then by 2021, it was up at 118 million hectares. So it's clearly increased. And a lot of these large-scale land acquisitions, or you might have heard of the term land grabs, have quite often been driven by increased agricultural opportunities in these lands. And when there are agricultural opportunities, it means that water is going to be used, because you need water from the rivers, from the groundwater aquifers, to make that land productive and produce whatever it is that you need to make. So we see various countries, quite often the Gulf states have been sort of focused in the analysis of investing in parts of Africa, the African continent, to grow food so that they can import it back to the Gulf states, because they are in a very dry region. So they need to look for land where there is water. There's a lot of uncertainty and very opaque levels of information around land grabs and large-scale land acquisitions, but it's looking as though there is a distinct trend of private entities investing in large tracts of land, whether it's for prospective reasons or actual agricultural activities. But the presumption is that there is large swathes of land that can be used for agricultural production, which presents itself as an economic opportunity. In one way, that is sort of along the debate of the way in which the global food trade has occurred, because not everywhere, not every single country can be self-sufficient. In fact, most countries are not self-sufficient in terms of food. So you have to buy food from elsewhere. You need to import food from elsewhere. And there are countries that are going to be exporting as an important part of revenue. So we see here a map that was, it's part of an article that was written by the late Professor Tony Allen, who came up with this idea of how there are flows of virtual water throughout the world, meaning that as a result of food being traded, as a result of goods being traded, there's also a pattern of virtual water flows. So the best example is that the cup of coffee that you had before you came to this lecture, it's probably 100, 125 milliliters. It's just a cup, but actually it took 130 liters of water to produce the coffee beans to make that cup of coffee. So if we think about the amount of water that's embedded in food and embedded in goods, then the flow of virtual water is significant. We're trading food and we're seeing a pattern, a major pattern of flows of virtual water. And it's quite interesting. Again, I bring it back to the EU context. The EU apparently imported 585 billion cubic meters of water in 2009. And as a bloc, the EU countries, they are the largest importing region. And so you can see a lot of arrows pointing to the EU region in this figure that you have. The US and places like China are major exporters, meaning that they produce a lot of food, but they also equally import as well, again, because of the fact that lifestyles, diets are changing, and that no country is self-sufficient. So if there are these major global trades of food, and there are these economic opportunities that are being sought for large-scale land acquisitions, you're going to be seeing a situation where, again, many communities are going to be subject to these global drivers that they don't have much control over. It's very hard to map out how these global flows impact on actual individuals, actual communities, but we know that there are many ways in which the access to drinking water is curtailed as a result of large-scale land acquisitions, because people don't have access to the land anymore. They're prohibited to enter the land. As a result of land being bought up, landless farmers have to go look elsewhere for job opportunities, for livelihoods. It adds on to burdens of people for getting safe access to water. So there are many compound effects, even though they might be seen as these global drivers, and it might be seen as something that private entities do. There are actual implications that come down on the everyday of people. And so if we're in a situation like this, I think one of the effective tools that we can leverage is to think about human rights, because there are human rights to drinking water and sanitation. There are human rights to food. There are human rights to environment now as well. Last year, the human right to a clean and healthy environment, there was a resolution on that. So if we have a bunch of these human rights, then we have more tools to hold states to account. States need to deliver on their obligations to their citizens who are rights holders. And if we are seeing a lot of these companies that are encroaching on people's livelihoods, onto people's safe drinking water, then I think there is large scope for states to re-examine how human rights are being upheld and to actually act on them. A lot of the arguments that I'm making here were derived from the insights that I wrote in a report that was commissioned by the European Parliament, and it's available on the internet, so you're welcome to look at it. Anybody can look at it. But it's very interesting how the European Union is increasingly looking at not only water diplomacy as a better way to support external countries, third-party third-party countries, but also to think about human rights as a backbone to how we can improve people's conditions around water access, around food, around energy. And so I try and end with a positive note to say that there is scope for a new water agenda, and that there are solutions, even though they might seem very complex, multi-layered, and context dependent. But if we can refocus our attention to how these harms play out to individuals, to communities, to the marginalized, to the most vulnerable members of our society, I think there is a lot of work that can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naho. Look at this. There's the clapping hands. You can see them on the right-hand side. I've never seen this. That's great. Yeah, normally if you were here, you would hear the clapping. Thank you very much, Naho, for a really great talk and really inspiring. And I hope there will be some questions, for which we have about 30 minutes time. I also use the opportunity to thank the 40 people that are here are in the Senatssaal at Berlin, Humboldt-University. So thank you for joining the live stream there. And so we ended up with about 120 participants here, and then altogether 70 here and about 40 there. So thanks very much for joining us. If you have questions, like I said before, raise your hands and then we will put you into the panel. Let me just look. Okay, and if you can also write your question in the chat, of course. So Stefan Thompson, I would just invite you to come into the panel, and the people in the background will do that. Let you in, and then you're welcome to ask your question.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. You can ask your question.
Yes. Thank you so much for the very interesting talk. My question would be about, you were talking that you were saying that there's different productivity of agriculture in one region, and I was thinking, what kind of opportunity might that be for regional cooperation, or maybe how could that be managed within a flexible way so that it could also be lead to sustainable managing of these. Yeah.
Shall I respond one by one?
Yeah, you could just respond straight away, please. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Stefan, for your question. I think it's a really challenging one because different kinds of analysis tell us how agriculture is done at different scales. Like the country profile is very different from what happens at the regional level, and what even happens at the catchment level, what happens at the very specific irrigation scheme level. And I think one of the key things, in many ways, you kind of answered your question, because the key thing is flexibility. And one of the big debates around international agreements around transboundary water in the last couple of years is to say, what kind of flexibility can we embed in these treaties so that we can take into account these uncertainties? If there's going to be climate variability, if there's going to be climate change, how can we ensure that there is some form of flexibility in water allocation? I think that's a start. And I would add that there needs to be further safeguarding of social welfare, basically, of farmers, because there now are things like insurance. There's now various things about weather forecasting and data for weather forecasting. But the question is, how can we ensure that if there are these situations of extreme weather-related incidents, how can we ensure that these people can somehow still maintain a livelihood? And in many ways, this is not just a question of what can countries do together in terms of international agreements. I actually think it comes down to the governments and delivering on their social contract to their citizens. And so on one hand, international treaties, international water agreements are important, but also if the state can't even sort of deliver on their responsibilities to their farmers, I think that's going to be a problem. Talking about productivity is not just going to be sufficient. And so I think this really, again, pushes the boundary on how we think about the relationship between water and society.
Are you happy with the answer, Stephen Thompson, or do you want to have a reply?
Very happy. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Well, then we can let in the next people, Tim Moss, and I think we can let the others in as well, Jörg Niewöhner and Hussein Jung, but they will speak in turn, but it will be a bit quicker, I guess, if we let them in one by one. But first up is Tim Moss.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, all good, Tim.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Naho, for a really inspiring talk. I was wondering, in terms of water diplomacy, how you can deal with these asymmetries in relations, which can be positional in terms of sort of upstream, downstream, like in the Nile. They can be political in terms of sort of hegemonic states versus dependent states, like in the Middle East, or they could be rich and poor regions. And the question for you is, how far, by broadening the scope of the debate of water diplomacy, how far does that help you deal with some of those fundamental structural asymmetries at play? I mean, is there a chance of discovering asymmetries the other way around that can kind of balance each other out by incorporating issues of food or issues of energy or whatever? Can you say something about that, and perhaps give some examples of that too?
No, I think that's a great question. One of the challenges with transboundary rivers has always been this situation of asymmetry. It's not, as you say, it's not just about the geography. It's quite often about the power and the power symmetry, the power to influence negotiations, the power to determine the dialogue and the discourse around river basin development or water sharing. These are all significant. And the past work that I've done with colleagues of the London Water Research Group has been quite power-centric, in the sense that we do talk about how do different forms of power, hard power, soft power, play out. I do, understand the question about, well, how much do you open up water diplomacy? If it becomes everything, then it becomes just about nothing. But what I would argue is that water diplomacy, I think, really needs to tackle head on these very interconnected aspects. In some countries, some regions, it really might be about water, food, and energy. In some countries, it might be about water, labor, and migration. That's where I think the contextual factors come into play. But as a result, I think, as you say, there could be ways in which there are new asymmetries that come out in the debate around migration, or there are new asymmetries that come out in the debate about renewable energy production. And it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the power asymmetry will be evened out or that power asymmetry will go away. In fact, I don't think it will ever go out, but I think it offers different ways of approaching the issue and not being fixated on the hegemonic view, as it were. The other point that I would make is that when we sort of think about power asymmetries, it's very tempting to think about the ways in which it's about infrastructure, or it's about economic development opportunities, and how one country might have a larger say or a control over water resources to deliver on those development ideals. But actually, one of the things that I would argue is that environmental degradation, bog standard environmental degradation, about water quality degradation, about ensuring environmental flows, that's something that's under discussed. And this is something that could, again, be something new brought into the debates that can also make us rethink about the power asymmetries as well. So by broadening up water diplomacy, different points of debate, as well as looking at under scrutinized aspects of degradation about environmental flows, I think really need to come much more into the debate.
Tim, a response to this quickly, or are you happy?
Just to say that's very convincing, and I think what it seems to be arguing to me is that by broadening the debate, you have a chance at least of revealing interdependencies between states or between regions that might not otherwise have been so visible if the debate is just focused on water and just focused on flooding or irrigation or whatever. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And we can get the next person in, Jörg Niewöhner. But while we do that, I will ask a question from the chat. So Jörg, please hold your question for a minute. I'm asking a question by Teresa Frommen from the chat, who is a groundwater researcher, Naho. She says, thank you very much for your talk. Who is the we you mean when you say we need to understand, we need to research? What kind of researchers do you think we need who are able to do this kind of research? And should they be actively engaged in policy advice? So how active should they be outside the university?
Wow, fantastic question. And you know, the use of we, the proverbial we, is always a very interesting one. It can reveal a lot of psychology almost. But the way I use the we here is that the agenda needs to be shared. So it's about you, it's about me, it's about other people in this online space. And by saying we, I'm hoping that we can, I'm hoping that I can convince you, I'm hoping that I can plant a seed in your individual heads that this water agenda is not something just for people in the Limpopo River Basin, or that it's for people in the Brahmaputra. Because of the fact that there are these global connections, because of the fact that there are these geopolitical interconnections, this water agenda can't just be isolated and diced up into different regions. And I think that's why it's more important to try and rethink this idea of water and society, and that it's not just water and stakeholders or water and river basin users. It's something a little bit more than that. So when it comes to who needs to be involved in terms of researchers, what kind of researchers, I think there is all the more reason why interdisciplinarity becomes important. It's not just the hydrologists, it's not just the irrigation engineers that need to be involved. It's not just about, you know, political scientists or geographers or development specialists that need to be involved. It's a range of expertise. Otherwise, you couldn't really see these interconnecting synergies or trade-offs. And at the same time, I don't think, you know, every single researcher needs to be out there talking to a policymaker and making impact. If that were the case, that would be great. Maybe we'll be in a different world. But impact takes a very long time. Changing policy takes a very long time. And so I don't, you know, I don't have these naive ideas that just because we've done a report for this organization, or just because we've done training program for this kind of river basin organization, that things are radically going to change. I actually think it's a very incremental, very cyclical process. And there are different points of learning for myself, as well as I've been doing the research, that I may have to change my policy messaging, for example. There might be ways in which that I have to rethink what kind of information is useful for a decision maker. So I don't think I don't think researchers should hang their head in shame if they haven't done any impact, or that they haven't talked to a policymaker. But it's about this community a collective community that's working towards a new understanding, critiquing the knowledge that I think is ultimately fundamental to any kind of change, policy or societal.
Yeah, thank you, Naho. Teresa, if you have a follow-up to this, please post it in the chat. She says, thank you here, Teresa. Thank you. And now I'm handing the question time over to Jörg. Your question, please.
Yeah, thanks. I only now realized that you're sitting next to a real plant. I somehow assumed that that was a background, but when it started moving, that's beside the point. Thanks for a great talk. I find the case for water diplomacy very compelling. I've one quick follow-up from Tim's question, and then one new aspect on the virtual water. On the follow-up from Tim, what is it about water from your perspective that makes it so useful as a medium almost to raise some of these sort of interconnections? Because I mean, I guess water diplomacy is not just sort of diplomacy that also includes water, but it's diplomacy through water, isn't it? So what is it about the medium that does that? And the other aspect is on the virtual water asymmetries that are so familiar pattern of the world. Do you think or water diplomacy might lead us to a situation that's similar to CO2 in the sense that we end up with a virtual water price or some sort of certificate or some capping system? Or do you think water diplomacy, so in itself, will be able to address this? Thank you very much.
Oh, great set of questions. I'll take on the first one to say what makes water so unique or charismatic or useful. I think there is one fundamental aspect that water is needed by both humans and the environment. It's a fundamental feature of our culture as well. So it's very much in your face. Even though groundwater, you can't even see it, it's very much in your face. If you don't have water coming through your taps, you will notice. If you can't flush the loo, you will notice. If you get ill from having bad water, you're definitely going to notice it. So I think there's something very visceral, there's something very tangible in that regard. And it's also very iconic as well, because this is an example that a lot of people use, so you may have heard, but if you look at banknotes, back in those days when we actually used banknotes and not just electronic currency, if you look at a banknote, go look in your piggy bank, there's at least one country from all your travels that you're going to find of a banknote that has a dam on it, or a major water infrastructure engineering feat. And through centuries, societies have been organized around how to control nature through the use of various infrastructure, the way in which we organize our landscape, how we cultivate the land, how we look at our landscape. So these kind of features, including the engineering features, are very iconic of society and where society was and where it's come from and where it's going to. So I think that's why it makes it very iconic for that reason. But the debate about insecurity is equally true about energy and food and nutrition as well. So I'm not saying water is at the pinnacle of all debates, but it's a really effective way to tie in these other very interconnected, very related topics as well. Moving on to your second question about what about certificates, what about some sort of capping? It's again a question that a lot of people have asked, and I don't think there's been a strong consensus in the sense that there's been debate about labeling virtual water, just like carbon footprint. Can we put it on a pack of sugar or a pack of rice or a can of tomatoes or something like that? But it hasn't really materialized in the sense that it's very difficult to trace this. And again, the ways in which food is traded, where food is produced, might seem obvious to look at, considering that we have all sorts of remote sensing techniques, but the way in which the global distribution and supply of food has become much more complex. I think it becomes much more difficult to say X many liters of water on this pack of rice or tomato can. And then there's a question of, well, even if you put a certificate, even if you put a label on it, would it actually do anything in terms of human behavior? And I think this is, a topic that I've started to look into, and it seems as though there's a certain amount of change that happens in terms of behavior, but at one point there's a saturation of too much labels, too much information, and people just want to go to the supermarket and buy their ingredients for dinner and just get home and eat that dinner. And they're not going to have an analytical report to look through, or even have that sort of luxury in many cases to do this. There's debate of taxes as well. There's debate of, as you say, capping. But again, if you look at large-scale land acquisitions, because of the way in which it's so opaque, it's very difficult even to say what kind of companies are investing where. And there's been a major report, again, commissioned by the European Parliament, that tried to identify what kind of European countries are investing in other places. It's been very difficult to identify that, because there are subsidiaries who sit outside or they're headquartered elsewhere. And so this strong regulatory mechanism isn't there. And that's why I go to this point of human rights. When it's very difficult to pinpoint strong regulatory measures, there needs to be other ways. We should pursue that, of course. If there are laws, if there are regulations, if people are dumping wastewater, then you've got to regulate that, of course. But then I think there could be other ways to hold states to account through human rights-based approaches, and also to have states be more stringent in how they have a relationship with the private sector as well. So right now, a lot of this is voluntary schemes. So it's about voluntary reporting of water use or voluntary reporting of water footprints. But what kind of mandatory binding measures can we make? I think that's a really interesting space.
Any comment back, Jörg? Thank you. And there are some thumbs coming from the audience. I guess that's from the audience. If we can let in Ho-Sung Chung now with his question. And I encourage everyone to raise their hands or post the question in the chat. We still have about 10 minutes time. So.
Yeah, do you hear me? Oh, yeah. Do you see me?
Hi, Ho-Sung.
Yeah, hi. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I'm a PhD student supervised by Tobias, and I come from South Korea. It's nice to meet you. Well, I could, like as a student coming from South Korea, I could, suggest a discussion about the conflict case between Korea and Japan. I think you can already imagine what I would talk about. Yes, about the seawater. Like Korea and Japan don't have catchments or watersheds sharing, but we are connected with seawater. And recently there's this announcement from Japan that they discharge nuclear waste into the ocean. And it is a special case. We don't share catchments. We are connected with seawater, and there's power tension between Korea, Japan, and China. So in the decision of the disposal of nuclear waste, there wasn't, there was not a clear definition about we, because I think there was not much discussion, with the neighboring countries, but more, the discussion was more active with WHO and like Australia or other like more Western countries, but rather less with neighboring countries. So like, could we discuss this, or like, could you tell us what you think about this water conflicts?
Wow, thank you for asking that question. It's a very courageous question to ask that even some politicians in my country, where I'm originally from, would scamper off and leave the room and turn off the internet. So really, it's a really courageous question to ask, I think. And the point about the we, I think, comes into question. One of the problems, I think, not just about this particular issue, about other kinds of maritime disputes, about territory, border, natural resources disputes, is that the implications of what gets decided by central governments are very detached from what local communities experience. And this is something that's really driven my work in recent years. And what central governments decide quite often can be very insular. It can often be based on ideas around efficiency or productivity, which is not necessarily shared by local communities who see the world very differently, who see their natural environments very differently, who rely on natural resources very differently. So, in increasingly, there's an attempt to understand the value of water, along with many other natural resources, including ecosystem services, about the value, which include also intangible. It's not just about the market values, but it's also about the intangible, the cultural, the spiritual, the the social cohesion factor, as it were. Just going back to your original question, I think one of the sort of challenges around this is that there's a big history, a very loaded history around the tensions around this. And again, it's a good example for those of you who may not know the East Asian region in detail. This issue hasn't popped up out of the blue. It's through many years of contentions around military dispute, about issues of sovereignty, about the ways in which previous imperialistic motives were played out in the region. So again, just like I've mentioned in my talk, I think it's very important to not just take a narrow focus, but take a broader view, a contextual view. Why is this aspect of environmental degradation very, very contentious? It's because there are also other broader factors that have, shaped the way in which governments think or not think in some cases. I'm not able to give you a full sort of explanation or a full analysis of the environmental degradation issue. I'm not a specialist on the specific nuclear waste aspects per se, but again, I just want to say it's a courageous question for you to ask.
Are you happy, Hosung?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Then we might have time for one last question if anybody has one. I would bring one in quickly to bridge the time, but then it's about, our time is about over, which the time went flying. So I'm going to ask something about water sovereignty. It just popped to my mind because we have been talking at our institute for a while. There is a concept like food sovereignty, and maybe people moved away from food security to food sovereignty, and there's a whole movement around this, but we've never really heard much about water sovereignty. And without having thought about it that much myself, I just wanted to throw this out there. Is this a concept that you that you could relate to, or are there specific problems with it, particularly in relation to the transboundary nature of aquifers and river basins?
Yeah, great question. And it's, as you say, it's very much sort of taken cue from the food sovereignty debates and campaigns that have been very, very effective and mobilized lots of civil society organizations, particularly in Southern America. And I think it's in that context, it was really wrapped around indigenous communities and their view of life, their view of justifying their cultural existence, their social role, as it were, and for that to not just be replaced by globalization or pressures from central government. Can that be transposed to water sovereignty? It's a tricky one, because I think for the notion of sovereignty is always so contentious in water in particular. We've had the Harman Doctrine, which was a sort of piece of principle, or sort of a way in which states often use to claim waters to say first, it's almost like first come, first served. And this Harman Doctrine has been very contentious over the past. Lots of international agreements have tried to overcome it. And this notion of sovereignty really still is something that grates against cooperation. So if you read a lot of literature around international water law, it's really about, well, how much sovereignty do you give up in order to achieve transboundary water cooperation? And no country is going to be happy to give up their sovereignty. But what I take from the essence of food sovereignty debates is that there is a big question that we need to get to the bottom of on justice. The food sovereignty debate was really around social justice, and increasingly there's debate around water justice, and we see that, for example, through campaigns against privatization of water so that people can have accessible, affordable drinking water. But I think we could extend, the thinking around how do we transform the relationship with society and water into one of ultimately justice. The words that I've been using, the most marginalized, vulnerable, having sort of a welfare scheme, making sure that there's a safety net, these really tie into debates of justice. And the fact that society systematically quite often has placed the highest burdens on the most vulnerable, the weak parties. I don't mean this in a way that they don't have agency. They certainly have agency, but the power asymmetries are so blatant in some cases. And the origins of environmental justice, the scholarship has come in the US and North America. It's very racially oriented. It's really about race. There's a lot of wastewater dumping, but it's really about how certain types of race and racial groups have been at the forefront of receiving these burdens and harms. So if we were to take something from the food sovereignty debate, what I would try and implement is to really give focus on these aspects of where are the injustices and what can we do? Who are benefiting from the existing arrangements, whether it's international agreements or governmental policies or climate change policies, even the national adaptation plans, for example, and who's losing out? I think these are all worthwhile questions to ask. It might be that we use a different term. We might not necessarily explicitly say water sovereignty. Maybe in 10 years' time, we'll look back on this recording and say, we should have come up with a better term. But I think that the key questions are already being needed to be asked around justice, about the way in which there needs to be some sort of transformation. It's not just a simple technical fix anymore.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Naho. That's a good way to end. I think with this last statement and the recommendation to look at justice, thank you very much. So this is the time where I thank you again, and I'm thanking also the audience for listening, including in the Senatssaal, and for asking your questions here in the panel and